And we're all set.
Thank you, Jacob. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight is the June 24th Charter Review Meeting of City Council. Tonight we will be reviewing sections 8 through 14 of the Charter. You should have all received an email yesterday with a packet of information by Cliff Shepard, which also incorporated comments from staff. And with that, I will turn it over to Cliff to start walking us through the first item tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. I hope, can everybody hear me? Nodding heads, yes, okay, good. I'm going to try to share the screen. Usually I have two screens, so it's much easier to figure stuff out. Today I have one because I'm away from the office, shockingly. Let's see, host disabled participant screen sharing. So someone needs to enable me to share my screen.
That would be Jacob, and he'll let us know when you have the authority to do so.
You should be
I
good.
figured you were on vacation
right.
or something from your background. It's not your normal office background.
No, this is my cabin up in the mountains, and it is delightful. I got to tell you, it's been just an absolute blistering 73 degrees here today.
Oh,
It'll be down in the 50s tonight. Sad.
I'm going to mute
Really
now.
sad. Okay. All right. So I have before you the memo that was provided, and it regards section 8, quorum. The changes that are here are explained, and frankly, I don't know what is your preference. I can go through and discuss them in detail, or just ask if anyone has any questions or any points they want to discuss. Bottom line is the changes that were suggested here were primarily based on obsolescence. Some of the old language just doesn't seem to apply anymore. And so you can see how it would read with changes below. There wasn't any policy reasons behind any of this. I don't see anybody raising any hands or any questions. Are we good to go then for that section?
Yeah, I think it cleans it up.
Okay. All right. All right. 9, section 9 is the introduction and passage of ordinances and resolutions. We got rid of a redundancy regarding only in written or printed form, because obviously these days we just use the printed form. I don't think we've had a handwritten resolution in probably my lifetime. So I doubt that that's a thing. And so there was also some issues of clarity as provided in the memo or requested in the memo we got from Ms. Goslin, which you've seen attached. And then the last part here was about the advertising. And this is a change that I suggested. There's a couple of reasons for it. This would have read previously, or did read previously, that you would advertise it on 2 separate days, or read it by title on 2 separate days, and they'll be at least 10 days prior to final adoption, and noticed in the general newspaper general circulation and so forth. A couple of things. First, there are items which can be advertised and noticed and read and have only one meeting that are ordinances. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones those are, but there are specific things that you can do as a city that do not require 2 readings, but can still be done by ordinance. In addition, most recently, I don't know whether you've been provided with an update on it, but the legislature in its wisdom has allowed us to avoid certain advertising by adopting an ordinance. If you haven't heard about it, I'll brief Mike on. He may already know, your city clerk may well know. And I would obviously suggest you do it because it'll save you some money. And over time, I don't know that we're going to have legal advertising in the way it's always been. Newspapers seem to be fading quickly. And so what we've said here instead is that if we're otherwise permitted by state law, then we are allowed to follow the state law, and we don't have to provide more advertising or notice than is necessary. And in addition, we will notice it in accordance with state law. So if it says at least 10 days, but state law requires 14, we'll follow 14. If it says at least 7, then we may not do a full 10 if something needs to be done quicker. And that's kind of the reason for these changes.
That is one that I would like to see if council would be interested in putting it in the parking lot until we get further understanding as to the means through which the notifications would take place. and what the state is requiring. Just because there are a lot of people who still look through the paper for for any changes that are going on. So I just want to make sure that we are fully informed about the means through which, or the mediums through which, any notice would come out. With regard to the days, that's more a function of how often we meet. We meet every other week, so it would be a 14-day or 13-day break between reading 1 and reading 2. The clarification that I would like is the mediums, as well as which ordinances would only require 1 reading.
I can provide that to Mike. I wish I could have remembered them off the top of my head. I can't. I just remembered when I went through this section there, and it was actually something that was not known to me until relatively recently in the last couple of years. And I found out that yes, indeed, there is at least 1, maybe 2 that can be done with a single reading. The other thing that, and again, remember where we are here. We're in a charter. And so the charter has requirements that must be complied with. And so you can always, and a number of my cities do this, decide that for their citizenry, they want to provide more notice than is required. It is essentially my advice to you that for your charter, what you should accept is what's required by law, so that if you're ever up against it, if you were ever in a situation where, you said, okay, we meet every 2 weeks, but do you ever have special meetings where, for example, because of some urgent or more than normal time frame, you're asked to meet quicker? Like a developer comes in and says, hey, look, I really need to get this looked at sooner than later. I don't want to lose my funding or whatever. And maybe that doesn't concern you. I'm not saying it should, but I am saying that happens from time to time. And so if you meet the minimum state requirements, would you still want to be bound to a charter requirement that requires you to go longer than that? You may. That's a policy question. But that's why if you were going to do more notice than is required by the law, there's a lot of ways to do that. By policy, you could do it by resolution. You can do, and that obviously could also be changed by subsequent councils. You could also do ordinance and be changed by subsequent councils if you chose to as well. But charter is kind of, this is the way you're going to do at minimum every single time. And that may or may not be what you want.
I tend to lean towards more time for citizens to provide input versus less. The last thing that I would want is, all of a sudden something pops up and they just, this is how it wasn't done in the past. And so it kind of hoodwinked us. So I would just like more information on this before we decide whether to move forward with this language or not.
I'll say I'm fine with Cliff's adoption because it keeps us in compliance with state law and it's a good solid baseline. But if it's something we want to put in the parking lot until we have everybody in on the conversation, then that's okay as well.
I like Cliff's language as well. I think it sets a nice standard, a baseline to go by, because there's not a committal time in there. And I think he made a good point that if we wanted to add time on that, we could. Cliff, can you scroll your screen? I guess it would be down a little bit so I can see.
Down? My camera.
Not your camera. Your monitor.
Oh, scroll it. Okay, I'm sorry.
The other way, other direction.
Okay, all right.
Right there.
Further? Okay.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I feel good the way it's written because it kind of opens the door that if we wanted to add time to it or we needed more time for our citizens, we could. So that's my position.
Counselor Golding?
Thank you, Mike. So I guess my thinking is that in the charter, I like referencing state law because that can always change. And, we don't really want to have to update our charter every time something changes in state law. Um, and if we want to do anything differently, my thinking is based on what Cliff is saying, if we can do it by ordinance or resolution, if that's an appropriate way to do it, then I'm okay with doing that and not necessarily having some of the specifics in the charter. I don't know, Cliff, is that kind of the direction that you're trying to go in with this?
Well, let me be clear. First, the amount of notice, as long as it meets the statutory requirements, it can always be more. So, whether you did that as a matter of policy and just directed staff, hey, notwithstanding that this is what the statute says, advertise it X number of days, we want you to do twice as long, or whatever. And this has been a thing. It's happened. I don't know if you've had controversies over comp plans, but boy, let me tell you, a lot of the cities I have had, and as soon as the citizens realize what a big deal it is, and even though they've been given multiple times to show up at meetings, they didn't, then it happens and they claim that they were hoodwinked. That's about the time that council say, well, we don't like them feeling that way, so we want to give them more notice, even though the law on all the notice was required. So I don't want to lead you to make a policy, but what I am telling you is what you put in your charter, no matter what else is out there, will be your minimum. And if the charter doesn't comply with the law, you'd still have to comply with the laws. The statute said, for example, there are super notices. Your clerk probably knows about when you do comp plan amendments that are substantive, and they have to have a map that shows on the advertisement and some other thing. It's called super notices for that reason. So if your charter wasn't broad enough to do that, the law would require you to do it to have a legally adopted comp plan amendment. So for my purposes, in terms of just deciding on what is the most legally easy to deal with, if you set your charter as we will follow the state law, but internally you decide, but we want to do more than that for whatever the issue, or for a specific issue. Maybe it's just for the comp plan, we want to do more than's required. Or maybe it's, here's a timely issue, the departure of a city attorney. We want to give more notice, not less, or less notice, not more. Things like that. You can do those kinds of things individually, either through resolution or through council or through an ordinance. Again, because as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements, nobody complains about getting too much notice. But your charter, if it has more notice than is required, and you would like to move quicker, you're going to be stuck with doing what the charter says, no matter what.
Councilor Dumont?
I appreciate the example of the city attorney and the charter and such. My concern ends up being if it's done by policy and not in charter, it's very easy for future councils to switch it.
That's
And
true.
that is, in my view, that's not necessarily permit. It doesn't help residents who are trying to stay on top of things when they hear, you vote the first time, it makes the beaches leader. Then people are like, whoa, what's going on? And they come for the second meeting and note their opinions. If we're able to lessen the time between two meetings or switch completely to just one meeting, the public who are too busy to actually pay attention and keep their fingers on all of the stuff that we're voting on in the city's day-to-day business, it puts them at a disadvantage. And I see the state's shortening of the requirement as far more prohibitive for public input as leaving it in our charter the current time frame. But I would need to, like I said, this is one of the reasons why I like it in that parking lot, to see what types of ordinances could go through a single reading or would need to have the two readings.
It's your pleasure. So again, if you've got something in front of you as a group And if you want to have longer discussion about it in another meeting with the parking lot issues, I will not lose any sleep. I'm happy to accommodate whichever you like.
Of course you won't lose sleep. You're in a cabin in the mountains.
That is right, and with a very good temperature as well.
Exactly. Perfect sleeping temperature.
So Cliff, what would be the right way to see if there's a consensus to accept the changes and move on versus putting it in the parking lot?
Well, I think, it's interesting. We discussed via email amongst us about what kind of things could be done at a meeting like this, since we're doing virtually and we're not meeting in person, and therefore, you have some sunshine issues to consider. I think the idea of essentially moving it to the parking lot is a decision that can be made, because it's not a decision substantively about what's happening or not happening. And so if that's a decision that's up to you, that you'd like to have on the floor right now, I think I would, whether you do it by a show of hands or a voice vote with the clerk recording, just so you know, it's basically your pleasure, because you could argue it's a motion to table until you can have further discussion, and you'd have the same net effect. It's just going to be tabled to whenever the parking lot meeting occurs.
So you're saying we could ask for a consensus by show of hands?
Yes, you could.
Or acceptance?
Yes.
Show of hands for acceptance? 1, 2, 3, and the mayor has no video, so I can't tell.
Her hand is up though.
Well, that's 3 for acceptance and 2 for not. So Mayor, I don't know if you can hear us, Mayor, but if you can chime in, your hand is raised.
I raised my hand. Can you see it?
Chris's virtual hand is up, but I didn't see 3 physical hands.
Chet, Fernando, and Dan had their hands raised. And so, Chris, your hand is raised, and you were, I guess she's a virtual hand raised, so that's 4. 4 to accept and move on.
All right. We will go on. And then let me also say that there will be a future time in which we consider, as you already know, what will be put on the ballot for the next go round and what will be delayed till a future ballot. And at that time, substantive discussions of all these matters in the form of an ordinance, which we then say, okay, well, we want to leave this one in for now. We will take this one out for now. Those things will all happen. So we're substantially off from the time this will become even a potential law in the town or in the city by virtue of a vote. And in that time frame, like for example, by the next meeting, I'll be able to tell you which are those issues that can be done with one reading. There, I just can't remember right now, but it was an eye opener to me to find out there was such a thing, and things that might require more times. Even if 2 readings is sufficient, you might need more because it's a complicated issue, and that's always something you can decide as you go, as long as you've met the minimum. All right, so let's move to section 10. This is when ordinances and resolutions take effect in emergency measures. These things were changed, and the changes that we made here had to do with punctuation, clarity. We had to change references to a supermajority vote for certain things regarding the emergency measures. And if, as you look through here, none of these were, as very rarely would it ever be that I would suggest a policy change based on something I've experienced. If I had something that I thought was worthwhile, I would tell you. But these are all clarity and punctuation designed recommendations.
And I'm not seeing any hands raised.
The only comment I have, and this kind of goes beyond this piece, is when is an emergency truly an emergency? So if we look at COVID, state of emergency was declared almost a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
And the whole purpose of a state of emergency is that means council or the regular body can't get together to be able to make decisions in a fast enough manner to be able to react to the emergency. As we've seen with the pandemic, we have been meeting in our regular timeframes, but we're still under a state of emergency, which shifts the power in the decision-making process. So I'm personally, I'm still just fighting with that in my mind. Is this really, and this is at the state level as well as the local level, is this really a state of emergency, or is it something else? And it might be something else that we haven't defined yet, but I don't think it rises to the level of a state of emergency as traditionally defined.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I can only tell you that it's when the governor says we have a statewide emergency, hurricanes pending, other natural disasters, pandemics, those things will be easy enough to understand. But even then, and if you look at what has happened, what we did not do during that time period, you or any other city that I know, is have a situation where, based on a provision in the charter, all of a sudden the mayor took control and said, I'm running the thing. That's not how it went. So in your charter in specific, and others that are similarly set up, that provision is primarily for things that are more localized and more of significant local issues that could have been based on an initial statewide emergency, but you have been severely impacted. A tornado has torn through your town and leveled important structures, maybe a water plant or the police and fire buildings or something along those lines, or maybe City Hall. But even then, whether you need to go to those extremes, it's kind of probably be one of those things that is apparent to you. To use the hackneyed expression, I can't define porn, but I know it when I see it. So it's probably that situation we're talking about. But it's hard to know that. Those do come up. They don't. It's not like they are as rare as a unicorn, but they are not frequent. A good example, I think, in our state was I'm trying to remember the little town that got hit here in the west part of Florida, which almost was it called Mexico? Isn't that a city in Florida, Mexico? I think the whole town was like leveled by the last major hurricane came through there, and condos and everything. It was flattened. They had nowhere to operate. So it happens, but it doesn't happen frequently.
I think
My
that was
concern ends
Mexico
up being
Beach.
that there's,
I'm sorry. Was it? What was?
Sorry, I was just saying, I think that was Mexico Beach, maybe?
Yeah, right. I think that was the play.
it's not even a concern, but it's a concern. It's more of a hypothetical concern, is those instances aren't laid out in this ordinance, like extraordinary. So there are emergencies, and then there are freakish emergencies. City gets leveled. And then there are long-term emergencies. Pandemic is a long-term emergency. And at what point does the mayor have the power to say, I am putting us in a state of emergencies, and these are the rules that we're going to play by? And how long does that last versus needing council approval to say, yes, we are in a state of emergency, and these are the executive's power, and this is how long they can last? I don't see that teased out within our charter.
I think that's probably accurate. This section, of course, deals with emergency ordinances and resolutions, but the section that you're talking about that we dealt with, I guess it was last week, or not last week, at the last meeting, it doesn't specifically come up with, here's what it is. Instead, it has specific breaks built within it beyond which they can't be, those powers can't be continued without a vote of a supermajority, I think it is, of your group. And so I think you're kind of under, and maybe there's a way to tease it out. Maybe this is something you'd have to go back to that section, I guess, and put it into the parking lot, because that's where this whole thing is discussed, or come up with a new section. But I think the idea, at least the protections they tried to build in there, and we tried to make more clear by taking away, for example, the ability of the mayor to run the police department without the police chief, is we said, look, you have only a certain amount of hours that you can essentially do this. And if you're not extended by the rest of us agreeing that this is a situation where that was justified, then that's going to change right away. And of course, if you think about, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that look like if that were to happen? It's, is it possible that somebody can do a lot of damage in a position which they shouldn't have assumed in 3 days? Yes. But is it possible that the council could take emergency action if needed because someone had done so in a ill-considered way and pretty quickly, maybe within 24 hours on an emergency notice? That's also possible. And it keeps you from having to go through okay, what is it this, is it that, is it the other? And I don't know, maybe y'all could come up with something that defines what those extraordinary powers are. But most often, the best definitions that you'll see will involve imminent danger to the health, safety, and welfare of the citizenry. And then you take it from there and say, okay, where are we? Is this just a group of citizens, for example, in a high rise that collapses in South Florida, like today? That obviously didn't affect the whole city. It's a horrible tragedy, but it didn't require the mayor to take over the city. It's got to be bigger than that. And I think that's kind of the way to look at it. So whether you want to put it in the parking lot, I certainly have no problem with any of that, and we'll never have it. It's your deal. It's up to you to come up with how you want to proceed. But in terms of the reasons and where you'll get with it, I just don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it might just that I'm thinking too deeply about a lot of these things. It's my job.
Yeah.
But that increased as a concern of mine over the course of the pandemic. So you get an emergency declaration, you get another one, and it's extended. It's been extended over way too many times now to still be considered an emergency, because you have now reduced what emergency means to an convenience versus an emergency. So
right.
Yeah, but thank you.
No problem. Do we continue, or do we have any more comment or discussion on this section? All right, I'm seeing nobody tell me stop, so I'm going to go. All right, section 11. I got to roll it up here so everybody can see it, and then put down this video so I can actually see what I'm reading. All right, this is about the publication, authentication of ordinances, resolutions. All the changes here were pretty straightforward. It was simply making it clear. I didn't anticipate there would be much discussion here, but if there is, I'm happy to hear it for it. Otherwise, let me know, or we'll go on. Okay, we will continue to scroll. All right, city clerk. Let me lower this again so I can see. There's one office of city clerk, and we just said there shall be an office of city clerk. We took out the part, obviously, that's now obsolete regarding November of 2000, and we tried to clarify the issue of who can remove is the city manager, but there's a punctuation issue that was unnecessary there. Again, these should be, I think, non-controversial, but if anybody's got anything, please let me know. All right, we will move forward. I wish all my meetings were this good.
All right, I'm going to be the cranky person.
Listen, if I wasn't get off my lawn guy, I don't know my identity anymore.
I'll be the cranky person. Should city council, I agree with city council seconding or approving the position, but should city council be involved in the removal of the position, especially since our two employees, as stated in the charter, as currently written, are the city manager and the city attorney. And it is up to the city manager specifically to determine what team he or she needs to be able to fill the will of the council. When you start having the council involved in the removal of certain employees who the city manager may say, is inhibiting his or her implementation of the council's will, I think that it pushes it into another level where it's got to be done publicly. So any removal and the reasons for removal have to be done in a public forum.
Mhm.
We don't oversee the city clerk. We oversee the city manager. We oversee the city attorney. It is up to the city manager to ensure that the city clerk, and we'll get into this later on, the CFO is doing his or her job appropriately. I just think that city charters are akin to a constitution.
Yes, they are.
And a constitution really needs to be the basic bare bones framework of what our community or country or state is going to look like. And anything that goes beyond that bare bones needs to be done in policy or ordinances. And so I'm not sure if this is kind of overstepping council's role in the firing of a city clerk.
Well, first of all, this is a thing which obviously is, it can go whichever way you want, and everything you've articulated is a good argument as regarding any employee who answers to the city manager. So it is very typical in strong manager forms of government or city manager or council manager forms of government that obviously you can't interfere with the relationship between the manager and the employees. You can't direct employees under the manager to do certain things, like come fix my pothole as opposed to whatever is on the work schedule next, or ask the police to investigate a specific crime that's personal to you, as opposed to call the police chief like any other citizen, or ask the city manager if there's something that needs to be increased in terms of patrols, that sort of thing. So that's very normal. However, if you're looking at what is in your charter right now, this is not this thing about removal not being effective. It's at least been in your charter, I guess, since the 2000 date that's placed in here. I don't know if it was pre-existed that date. And I can at least tell you, and don't confuse me explaining the argument with making the argument, because I'm not. This is not something where I can say, oh, based on experience, you should do this. But I can tell you that the argument is, while you are correct in your charter that the two employees that answer to you are the city attorney and the city manager, it is actually more typically three. It is more typically the city clerk, the city manager, and the city attorney. So in typical charters, all three answer to ultimately the council, and ultimately the council makes a hiring decisions on all those three, because those three most directly work for the council, while they also do work for the city manager. It is kind of a co-employer relationship. For example, I am assuming this is true in Jack's Beach. It is in every other city. Any other city council person in any city that I represent has the authority to pick up the phone, incur legal expenses, and ask me for my advice about whether they can vote and have an ethical issue, about what an ordinance draft means, about what legal issues might be facing the city. They don't have to go through the manager for that, and that's not considered interference. Similarly, if the city council in any of the cities that I represent needs certain documents, they can go to the clerk directly and say, hey, can you get me the minutes from this meeting? Or can I get a copy of the comp plan. I need a latest draft and those things without going through the city manager and without it being considered interference with administration, because those are the people you would go to get that information. However, you couldn't, for example, direct the city attorney not to talk to the city manager, nor could you direct the city clerk to don't respond to him, only respond to me. So it's you're both the employers in a sense of those positions, because they all are directly having feedback and input from you and taking feedback and input from you. That is the argument to leave it the way it is. And it kind of picks up on that duality. The city manager says, hey, I think this person needs to go, but you have the final say because he or she works for you as well. And you could make a decision, and maybe would, that in the case that's being presented, that this person is more valuable to you in this moment and needs to be hung on to, and maybe it's the city manager who has an issue. And so the argument, again, it's purely policy to you. And the way you laid it out, Mr. Mott, that's exactly the way it would be laid out by anyone who says, you know what, this should be left to the manager, and you're not wrong. That's a good argument for that as well.
Yeah, I just think for me, it ends up being what I said before, but then again, the public nature, if a city manager decides that a city clerk is no longer fulfilling his or her duties, that puts it into the public realm, because it needs to go in front of city council, where no other city employee would need to go in front of public council to be removed from his or her position. That ends up being my concern, because, we know the city clerk as, there's a difference between us asking for information, and we can ask for information from anyone without going through the city manager, and then us providing direction, and that direction should only go to the city manager or the attorney. Once we go outside the city manager or attorney, information is perfectly fine, but it ends up being the removal and the public nature of what that removal would entail that concerns me. Because we had nothing to do with the oversight, the evaluations, or anything else of these employees. And so I'm a little about that. I'm uncomfortable. I guess the thing goes with uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with having to have the removal of an employee, with the exception of a city manager or a city attorney, having to be done in public.
Mm-hmm. The floor is open to discuss the issue. You can obviously see that the change would be easy to make. We just strike everything after the word city manager, put a period there. So if that's the way you guys want to go, but the floor is open for that discussion.
And Cliff, I would like to point out before there's more conversation on it, is that the clerk position is not the only position referenced in charter with regards to the removal being ratified by council. We also have that reference to the chief financial officer in section 14. And I'm not sure if that's in there for the police chief as well, but I think that may be under the code of ordinances. But the same situation, I believe, exists with the police chief and the CFO as well. The CFO specifically referenced in the charter. Just wanted to throw that out there.
And while they are both important positions, I just don't think that removal of those positions should be up to public scrutiny, because we as elected officials have no say over their jobs, whether they've been doing a good job or a bad job. Our only oversight is whether the city manager has been doing a good job or a bad job of overseeing those individuals.
And to clarify, I believe it's just the appointment of the police chief, which is section 23-17 of our code of ordinances. But I don't believe the removal is called out in the charter or the codes, just the appointment. But the CFO is in there as well under section 14.
it's the removal that I have more of a difficult time with than the appointment.
Thoughts by council? Councilor Golding.
Yeah, after listening to the discussion, I guess I'm not really sure why we would even need to be involved in it if we're not. I know Cliff said that there, some cities do have the city clerk being under the city council, or the city council hires them. But in the case where in our case where we don't do that, then I'm not sure why there would be a need for the city council to approve their termination, either the CFO or the city clerk. I don't know if anybody can shed any light on that, Mike. I mean, in any other cities where you've been, what have you seen, or Cliff? I mean, any other cities where the city clerk does not report to the council? What is typical there?
I'll let Cliff weigh in.
Okay.
He's seen
Well,
more charters than I have.
I've seen a few. The answer, you're asking the why question. And so in this regard, I can tell you based on what I have seen, what I think, but since I wasn't there when these charters were drafted and what the thought process was, I do know that not surprisingly, sometimes imitation is the highest form of flattery. So you'll find that a charter has certain language you think is unique, and then you start looking around and find every other charter has the same language. I suspect that in that process, it would be wrong of me not to note the possibility of lazy lawyering by somebody who says, "Hey, what's the charter look like? Hey, let's go look what the city next door does the same thing." But as a practical matter, if you think about the people that we've spoken about, CFO is a little bit out of the box, but clerk, police chief, maybe the fire chief, we haven't discussed that. I don't know whether it applies to you. These are high visibility, much less so the public works director, who, by the way, is an unsung hero in every city because they're the ones that really keep people from screaming. But if you look at who is the most high profile in most communities, your fire chief, your police chief, your city clerk, your city manager, less so your city attorney. And again, I think CFO is a bit unique here. And because of that and their ability and frequent interaction with the public, you typically see some sort of a public reaction. Now, I know we didn't see this in the recent departures of the city attorney, but there were, I think, publicity reasons that kind of led the public to not need to take sides. It was really only one side of that issue. But in a situation where a police chief is popular, for example, with the public, but not maybe popular with the city manager, and the citizens start calling their elected officials, and the elected officials are bound by the charter to say there's nothing we can do about it, they don't particularly feel good about giving citizens who vote for them that answer. What do you mean you can't? What do I elect you to do? That kind of thing. And so as close as I can come to a policy explanation about why city councils stay involved, even though they could change it in their charters where they didn't have to, and certainly that would give more authority and less public display, if you will, to the council, to these matters that involve personnel and that can be touchy. If the alternative to that is having a bunch of citizens calling you and coming to your meeting and saying, "Why didn't you stop him? He shouldn't have removed this person. This is the greatest fire chief we've ever had. This is the greatest police. This clerk is wonderful. She does everything for me. He does everything," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if your only answer as an elected official is because we can't, the next thing you're going to hear is, well, then change it so you can. So again, I'm telling you what the arguments are and the whys are, but it's a policy matter for you to decide.
Mike seems to have dropped off somewhere. Chet.
Yeah, my two thoughts is I liked what Cliff said about the city clerk working for us in a lot of aspects. She does, or he or she does work for the council. Is another one. I feel like if in our form here in Jack's Beach and having us, kind of like a board, this would be one of your top positions in a company, and that your board would most likely sign off on the hiring or removal of said person. So that's kind of how I look at it in kind of comparing our government to a private entity, and also kind of taking some of what Cliff said of them being an employee of the city, but also of the council, similar to the attorney, similar to the CFO. And then, God, I had another one, shoot, and I forgot. I also feel like it's also a good, check and balance type thing here, that we kind of talk about, where it is kind of a check on the city manager of, oh man, he doesn't like this city clerk, so he gets rid of a city clerk or whatever, just, of to Cliff's point, a position of relative publicity, public forum. I mean, somebody that's at all the council meetings and is there during campaign times. And if you go to the 12A, all the powers, all the duties. So it is a relatively public position. So it is kind of a check, in my opinion, on somebody that is involved in the council work, as well.
Dan?
So Chet, I won't beat the dead horse. Chet kind of hit the point that I was going to make about the checks and balances. So I'm in favor for the way it is written, with the changes that Cliff has suggested.
I'm still uncomfortable with the if the city clerk is not doing a good job, we cannot fire the city clerk. It's up to the city manager to determine the performance of the city clerk. We can fire a city manager who is keeping a bad city clerk because things are not getting done appropriately. So I am looking more at not in checks and balances. For me, the checks and balances falls in line with, we are the council. We set, these are the things that we want done. We rely on the city manager and the city attorney to get it done. If it doesn't get done, it's on him or her in both positions. It's up to the city manager to assemble the appropriate team. Part of that team is the CFO and the city clerk. That's how I view this, because if the city manager determines that the city clerk is not helping to move the city forward, and we say, no, you cannot fire him or her, the city manager still has to try and work with a city clerk who is not advancing the city. And we only evaluate the city manager, not the city clerk. And we have taken the ability of the city manager to remove the city clerk who is not helping the organization from the equation. That's, I'm looking at it more in a hierarchical, structural sense.
Councilor Golding?
I would just respond to Georgette to say that I don't think that this is taking anything away from the city manager, because the city manager does have options. And, I think that we're aware of those options that the city manager has. And it could be done publicly, or it can be done privately. So I just don't think that it's taking anything away from the city manager by any means, but I understand your concern about this now making it making it public if the city clerk, because the city manager, could talk to the clerk and say, look, you're not performing well, and ask the clerk to consider resigning. And the clerk can do that, and then there's no public issues, right? But if the clerk chooses not to do that and there remains to be issues, then the city manager does have to, if it becomes public, well, then the city manager has to explain to us why the city clerk needs to be terminated. And so, I agree with Chet. It does seem to force some accountability on the city manager to have reasonable reasons for removal. But yeah, I guess I don't agree that it takes away anything from the city manager as it's currently written.
I wouldn't say that it takes anything away from the city manager. But I would say that it will put, if a city clerk is politically astute, he or she would know to get counsel to be on his or her side and inhibit any termination of employment. That said, this isn't a hill I'm willing to die on, just because the traditional role of the clerk is that it is a council employee, even though in our charter it's not. But I am concerned, I still have a concern, and I would vote no on this point going to referenda, because I do see this as inhibiting the city manager, even if in a slight way, from developing the team that he or she needs to be successful in implementing council's direction.
It's not, I'm confused though. It isn't going to referendum though, is it? We're not changing. We're just leaving as is, so it doesn't have to go. I guess, I think if we were changing to take out the approval vote and the removal vote, that would be on the referendum.
Correct. That's correct. What you're seeing is what's written now. So that this is under the current system, removal of the city clerk is by the manager, but it has to be approved by the council. So it only goes to referendum if you decide to strike everything after city manager.
Any more discussion from council?
Do we go forward, Mike, or do we have a discussion about putting this in the parking lot? Where are we now?
Is there a consensus to accept the way written by Cliff?
Okay. And again, there will be opportunities for further discussion once this all makes it to an ordinance, where y'all then get to pick and choose what goes forward. So
Sandy had her
and in
hand up.
between that,
Well, I was just raising my hand because I thought that's how we were going to do the consensus again. Sorry, guys.
I was going to do the same thing. So you want to show up by raising our hands, Mike?
Sure. If you want to raise your hands, if your thought is to move forward with the way Cliff has written it. I see 4. We're good to move to the next item.
all right.
5, 4, 5. Yep.
All right. The next deals with duties and powers of the clerk. And the changes here were essentially based on redundancy, things that weren't necessary. The only change that is somewhat substantive but has good judgment behind it, my good judgment, is the idea that the church clerk is authorized to issue warrants and such as that, as opposed to shall. And you'll see that change right there in the second sentence. It says the city clerk shall issue all warrants for offenses against city ordinances. And the reason authorized is better, in my opinion, for that section is because as soon as you start seeing the word shall, everybody and their brother will tell you that that means it must be done. And so that if someone comes in and is upset about a code enforcement issue or some violation of city code, they can then go to that poor city clerk and say, you're not doing your job because it says you shall issue warrants. And so that was the thinking there. That's obviously, that is one of the areas where it is policy, but it's also good judgment, and it's mine that you should change the word shall to authorized so that you don't put your clerk in a bind about not doing his or her job because they didn't issue a warrant for something that nobody deems important except the citizen who's screaming that the clerk is not doing their job. All right, I don't see any people coming forward. Are we good? All right, this is, we'll move on to 14, the city finance officer. We've already discussed the removal issue here. And where we changed here the word shall to may, again, giving the city manager the authority to remove, but doesn't mean that you have to do it. And I think it's more of a showing of authority that you have the authority to remove, but you're not required to remove. And for some reason, the word shall in this context seemed like a command, where instead the idea that you have the authority to do it is what should be intended here. So that was my choice here. Obviously, that's up to you guys. And it would be consistent with Mike's discretion over other employees. Now, more important issue is the one that was raised by staff, and this is clearly a policy question, and that is whether or not the whole section should be deleted or at least relocated. And there's a memo from Ms. Gossett that explains why she's raising that as a possibility. I think she asked the question, I'm trying to remember, but I think she asked the question in the memo, is it normal to have all this stuff spelled out in a charter? And again, I don't know what normal means. But you know, there certainly are employees of a city who are not named out or spelled out in the charter. So it's certainly not something that has to be done, such as, you know, see the details here, 5 years of auditing experience. And so basically a job description. Now, those are minimum requirements, and you may want them, and you may want them in your charter. But if at least part of Ms. Gossett's point is that seems like something that you wouldn't ordinarily see in a charter, I can't tell you that I've ever seen language exactly like that, but it doesn't give me any heartburn. It's basically your charter, and if that's what you want, you could put it in there or leave it in there, which is where it is now.
Councilor Dumont?
Same concerns with the CFO that I have with the city clerk, but even more so, it's a heightened level here where it's very rare that a CFO is a council employee. If a city manager were to remove a CFO, like just not have a CFO, I think that would be a poor decision on behalf of the city manager, which could then be followed through by removal of said city manager by council. I do not believe the city finance officer should be in the charter, just like the Beaches Energy director shouldn't be in the city charter, or Parks and Rec, or Public Works. Those are positions that the city manager needs to oversee and have control of. We need to really focus on city clerk, city manager, and city attorney, and it's up to them to get what we want to have done. I am of the belief that a lean, mean charter is better for a community than one that goes on and names everything down to the animal control officer.
Any other comments from council?
I think if we were starting from scratch, I would happen to agree with that statement. I'm always for less is more on these kind of things. But my question for Cliff is, to completely take something like this out of a charter, it seems like a much bigger project than simply cleaning it up.
Well, I will tell you, I haven't jumped ahead to see if there are other references to the chief finance officer can be done with the global surge. But assuming that this is the only reference to the city finance officer, and I do know that there's another section, I think, regarding budgeting and so forth. And I think that Ms. Gossett was suggesting that it be moved to that section if it's not deleted in its entirety. I don't think I don't think it's a problem in terms of the physical creating an amendment, because basically it's just a lot of strike throughs. And if there's any reference to it that makes no sense without that reference, we have to work on that. But I'm not aware of that as I'm sitting here talking to you today. What is a bigger issue potentially is public perception, because again, it's not like we're making these decisions for the citizens. They will make the decision at the ballot box. What we are suggesting in any charter amendment is that these are what we think are good ideas, even though, and this is important for you all to know, we're not allowed to advocate for them. We're only allowed to provide, here's the change, the summary and so forth, and here's when it will appear on the ballot and read up on it. But you can individually, for example, lobby for or against a change, even if it's one that you don't like, you don't have to, and you don't want to support. You're welcome to hold a town hall as an individual and say, hey, we had to put this on the ballot because I got outvoted, but I hate it, don't vote for it. You can do that. But what I will say in answer to your question, Mr. Stokes, is that when you've got something in your charter and you take it out, people will tend to ask questions why. And here, again, you know your citizenry better than I do, but if I was going to make some assumptions, I would expect someone to say, or perhaps, given that we're relatively conspiratorial these days as a society, hey, they want to do something weird with the finances and they want to get rid of the finance officer so they can do stuff that we don't approve of, and that's why they're trying to get rid of this, and watch him like a hawk, and they shouldn't be. You could see some backlash along those lines. But in terms of, is it in most, I mean, whether this would satisfy your voters, well, most charters don't have it. Well, ours does, and we should leave it that way. It's hard to predict how people react to any given situation. They seem to be comfortable, if you'll pardon the adage, with old shoes. They like old shoes, they're comfortable, they fit. And so even when some of the old shoes could need a shoe shine, they might be fine with it just like it is. And so you might suggest, hey, this is to make it more consistent with other charters. This position isn't going away. It will still answer to the city manager. We will hire a qualified person. Obviously, we need that person, but it's just that they don't need to be a charter officer because, well, I won't say lean and mean. I will say we prefer a lean and grumpy charter. And so, and maybe that will be sufficient to get the voters to vote for it. I just don't know.
Councilor Jansen?
Yeah, so I'm good with the way it's written and with the amendments there. But I do think that if there's a section that addresses budget, that it makes sense to move it, and so it's all captured in one area in the charter. I'm for that, because we've done that many times when I was with JSO, where you would have references to one policy and our written directives towards another one. I can think of an example right off the top of my head. Issuance of notice to appears. Sometimes they were given, there's a blanket statement on, but sometimes we would enforce in a big event to go ahead and use them for alcohol violations or something like that. And that was in a separate section of the written directives, and they finally moved it together with all the rules for notice to appears. So moving this section to a budget area makes sense to me. I like the way it's written, but let's put it where it belongs if there is a section for it.
I second that. That was going to be a follow-up, was if there is, for sure, I would say that it would make way more sense to be in Chapter 7, Budget and Finance, than the city clerk. Whether it's something that needs to go away, maybe that's a parking lot. Is parking lot ideas of, maybe that's the ideas of parking lot is sections that aren't needed. And maybe that's something that we come back to and talk about as a group at another later point. But for a start, moving it into the correct area of budget and finance of city finance officer, and 14 and 14A would make more sense than being in chapter 2, in my opinion.
Any other thoughts by council? So I guess maybe a two-part consensus question. Is there a consensus to keep the language as rewritten by Cliff? And that is a yes. And then is there a consensus to move the language to the rest of the financial section of the charter? And I'm seeing a consensus on that as well. So
All
Cliff,
right.
to accept your language and move it to a different section of the charter.
And when we get to that section, Mike, I will have moved the language so you'll see it in the context of that entire section. So it'll get reviewed again regardless, and you'll see it in context over there. Now,
Before we
we've moved.
move on, I see Fernando still has his hand raised. Fernando, do you have a question on this or a final comment? Nope, there goes the hand. And he's saying no, he's good. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we, on 14A, it dealt with a lot of the responsibilities of what the city finance officer is supposed to do. But I found it personally lacking in clarity and being far more confusing to try to understand what I was able to discern what it was trying to do, but it would have helped substantially with more sentences, with more periods, more commas, and so forth. So consequently, I took some liberties here. I added only one thing substantively, and that is a reference to state law, because automatically you have to apply state law here, but there was no reason to leave it out of the reference of what the CFO has to comply with. But in addition, I just thought that it needed a little bit more reorganization and needed to get rid of some of the run-on sentences, which could be done with some punctuation. Obviously, it leaves the question of deletion or relocation of the entire section, and unless something changes, I'm going to assume that whatever we decide, it'll be relocated, and then maybe it'll be considered at some future date, either in the parking lot meeting or whatever, for deletion. But so the memo from Ms. Gossett still applies here. The only other substantive change was the recommendation from Ms. Gossett that while the monthly financial reporting to the city manager should continue, and I guess would continue, she proposes that the reporting to council be quarterly. And I primarily, what I took away from the memo is because of the amount of work and pulling together the reports, and there doesn't appear to be, at least in her view, a desire of the council to be reviewing those kind of level of detailed financials literally every month. But whether that's true or not, I'm not trying to speak for Ms. Gossett. I'm just going by what our memo said. So this, what the rewrite is here, as I roll it down to how it would read with all the changes, is essentially her change regarding quarterly versus monthly for certain things, and my changes, plural, of trying to shorten things up and make the actual responsibilities of the CFO sort of easier to comprehend, because where a period would help, we added it.
Councilor Jansen.
I agree with the quarterly review versus the monthly. And I also think that we should move this into the budget section as the previous charter amendment, so that it's all under that one section again.
Any other comments from council?
I just had a question. If we were to go to quarterly, I agree, 1414A move to chapter 7, but if we were to go to quarterly, I think, there is a lot of times where we just kind of breeze through the vote because it doesn't change much month to month, but I feel like there may be times in the future where there could be a significant change month to month. And I guess the question is, if we were, what do we have to be able to ask that question of the CFO if need be, in a council meeting where we may say, something happens in the world and all of a sudden May is a terrible month. And we say,
Sure.
Mike or Ashley, can we have a report of
Mhm.
May's financials or something? I don't see anything in here that says, that is an ability. So I just want to kind of ask that question of Cliff and Mike on that. It's a totally hypothetical, but just something that, us or another council may look and see, oh, wow, we had a bad month, but we don't have a report. Why do you think quarterly makes a ton more
Mhm.
sense? I feel like there's always that one, and I would just,
Yes. And it is way more realistic and more likely to occur than you might imagine. And I've experienced it in multiple cities. And I'll give you the example of when it's occurred in each and every case. And that is with the debris removal after a major hurricane. Because even if, and I'm assuming your city has contracts in place in theory to deal with it, the bottom line is when those debris removal contracts are needed, that is when, at least in the cities that I have represented, those contractors decide to go where the biggest money is. So you have a contract at a set rate of X per ton or X per truck. I forget how it works. But they can go to Alabama and make 3 times the rate. Their contract with you, come find me. I'm going to go somewhere else. And so now you're left to the open market. Your pre-negotiated rate is out the window. You're paying 3 times what you bargained because you can't get debris removal and it's dangerous. And you need to know where you stand financially and what are your chances of being reimbursed by the FEMA and all those things. So that's a very realistic possibility. It's not a wild possibility. It's something that probably will happen if you get hit by a hurricane. So with that in mind, how important is your question? It is important. Here's what I think the answer, though, is. I think the answer is, again, your city manager still has to answer to you, and the finance officer still has to answer to your city manager. So I can't fathom. Obviously, it's easy to say because I have a sense of we're not personal friends, although I really like Mike, and I hope he considers me at least friendly, but we didn't have a pre-existing relationship. So my assumption is, though, that Mike would, as a competent manager, say, of course we're going to get the reports because we all need to know where the money is because the situation is unprecedented and this is a big deal. And he need to talk about going to get a loan in the short term and, a grant. Who knows? There could be all kinds. But your safety valve, as it were, is the job security of your city manager, who, if they didn't mandate that, would probably have their own problem with you guys. And so it doesn't provide for it here, but I don't think it needs to, as long as you have any manager who values their own job security.
And Cliff, if I can just add on to that, Councilor Stokes, to give you a little, and the rest of council, to give you a little bit more security with regards to that. Section 31, duties of the city manager. There's a specific statement that says one of the duties is to prepare and submit to the council such reports as may be required by that body. So if you as a council say, we don't like what's going on in the world and we would like a report brought to us at the next meeting that explains where we are financially with regards to expenditures, debt, bond, revenues, whatever the case might be, that's a report that you're asking for, whose deliverance would be the responsibility of me through the charter.
Or are there any more comments or questions about this section and the changes? And I guess the question I would ask of you, I hope you've all given it your eagle eyes. I tried to make sure that I didn't substantively take away or add any responsibilities to the finance officer. I just wanted to make sure that anybody reading it with a reasonable education could understand what the finance officer is supposed to do. So If any of you think that I did something here that substantively changed or added something to what they're doing, speak up, but I tried not to do that.
Counselor Golding?
I would just say, I look at this as we're sitting as a board of directors, and, I kind of feel like, based on what we've seen and what I've seen in the last couple of years on the council and those reports that we get, it is hard to see significant changes from month to month. So I'm okay with the quarterly reports, and I feel that we could definitely get reports if we needed to. I don't see that this is anything that would prohibit us from requesting anything more frequently if we wanted to. I just see the charter as requiring that we get those every quarter. So I'm fine with changing it to quarterly.
I don't see any more hands raised, so maybe a two-part consensus. Is there a consensus to keep the language as Cliff drafted with the reports going to quarterly? And there's the majority, and you can keep your hands up if you're good for having this all moved to the other financial section in the charter. Yep. Okay, so that's going to move as well. So 14.
Okey-dokey. Well, unless somebody has anything for me, my portion of this meeting appears to be concluded, and I must tell you, I appreciate the opportunity to work from the mountain as opposed to the city area of Orlando, and enjoyed seeing you all again.
Thank you, Cliff, and thank you, Council. And just as a reminder, tonight was sections 8 through 14. Our next meeting for the charter review will be July 22nd. It will also be a 5:30 Zoom meeting, and we will be reviewing sections 15 through 18 of the charter, of which the predominance of those sections are related to elections. So again, we will get information to you in advance, and we will see you all on that date. Thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Cliff.